Good afternoon and welcome everyone to another installment of the series organized by ISGAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. This is a series that addresses historical tropes in contemporary anti-Semitism. And we need, of course, the historical to understand the contemporary. The series brings out the perennial patterns in the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and sheds light on exactly why it is the longest hatred. The aim of the series is to elucidate the millennial themes, the variations on those themes that bring out the essence of anti-Semitism. The aim is to expose and explain why the phenomenon is at once ancient and modern. Third, the purpose is to impart a deeper understanding of how what was once the scandal of anti-Semitism morphs into a fashionable anti-Semitism. And finally, the aim is to enable participants in the seminar to recognize the phenomenon in all its subtle manifestations and to seek ways of responding to it. So themes that are examined in the series include the anti-Semitic appropriation of truth, or the word of truth, the authoritative word, usually through propaganda. Other themes we see recurring entail blood libel, purity of blood. And then there's the drive for redemption or salvation. The anti-Semite strives for purification and to take himself or herself to be purified, saved, above others. So here's some of the things that throughout the series you see touched upon. The series brings out the implications of theological and ideological tropes in anti-Semitism, both historical and contemporary. And in the end, the series will situate contemporary anti-Semitism within the eternal context of ethical demands and imperatives. It will pose the ethical questions that implicate each of us who encounters the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. The questions put to the firstborn of the first human being: where's your brother and what have you done? Today, we are honored and privileged to have Dr. Ellen Cannon to speak with us about American higher education pedagogy. Dr. Cannon will consider the role and absorption of Soviet propaganda in the normalization, yes, the normalization of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Dr. Cannon is professor of political science and Jewish studies at Northeastern University. She is an expert on American Jewish politics, as well as the growth and ideology of the BDS movement and the ideologies of terror organizations. Professor Cannon is a member of the Wexner Heritage Program and an academic engagement network, the Academic Engagement Network. She's a board member of the American Jewish Committee and a senior research fellow at ISGAP. It is my great honor, my great privilege to welcome my very close friend, my esteemed friend, Dr. Ellen Cannon.
Thank you so much, David, for those kind words, and you are my dear friend. It is very much an honor to be here with you this morning. And today I'm going to examine two distinct elements. First, my research is going to look at the clear role of the Soviets, especially Stalinization, and its impact on what we are experiencing today throughout the globe, and that is virulent anti-Zionism and, of course, its relation to anti-Semitism. In my research, I look at the period of 1940s to 53, the Cold War era, and ultimately, if we have time, to look at the role of the United Nations and the role of the international court system, as well as the role of the huge effort of the human rights era to assist in the development of anti-Zionism today. The ultimate question is how this is directly impacting American higher education, which it certainly is, and we will look at how anti-Zionism in a very large portion of American higher education has been normalized and absorbed. Let's take a look at some of this extremely relevant information. For several years, we have heard that the so-called new anti-Semitism is a contemporary form of the recirculation of historical anti-Semitic tropes. My presentation will argue that the current resurgence of anti-Semitism is more complicated than that. More than its complexity, contemporary anti-Semitism has penetrated American higher education in the humanities and in the social sciences through the application of left-wing ideologies, political and politicized theoretical models and concepts, and argumentation that is neither factual nor objective and very far from scholarly. Scholarly concern with this development is not limited to those dedicated to studying the dangers of the longest hatred in recorded history. What is at stake is the future of the American Academy and the standards of excellence that we will be judged by. According to Professor Alan Johnson, it is essential that we understand the real danger of anti-Semitism posing today. In contrast to earlier iterations based on theology and racism, contemporary anti-Semitism is based on the demonization, dehumanization, the delegitimization of Zionism, Israel, and Jews. This current iteration is no less dangerous than Nazism, as it does not call for the making of policy adjustments of the Israeli government. Instead, it is calling for the termination of the Jewish state of Israel. And thus, contemporary iterations of anti-Semitism not only delegitimize the right of Israel to exist and of self-determination, but in doing so, it promotes genocide. Professor Johnson draws our attention to a linguistic technique, and he refers to this as articularity processes, which are employed by anti-Semitic anti-Zionists. The process takes elements of old discourses and puts them together for use in public discourse in new ways, referred to as moments of new discourse. Today, moments of public discourse used globally include Zionism equals Nazism, Israel is the Third Reich, the IDF is no different than the SS, Palestinians are today the Nazis that we experienced as Jews, and of course, their big one is the slogan of Jews are today's Nazis. This process not only reframes our understanding of Jews, of Zionism and Israel, it casts all three in the role of oppressor, and thus it has transformed the victims of the Shoah to be the oppressors of new forms of hatred. Today's anti-Zionism not only absorbed the propaganda of Mein Kampf, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the ideas created and circulated by professional Nazi propagandists, it reflects the absorption by the Soviets of these techniques, as well as their equally sophisticated anti-Semitic propaganda campaigns, resulting in the total erasure and annihilation of Jewish and Yiddish culture, institutions, scholarship, literature, the performing arts, music, and most of what we love about the history of Jewish life. Violent antipathy to all aspects of Zionism expressed in the Soviet Union over these many years has deep historical roots and numerous motivations. Opposition to Zionism originated prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, and it has been relatively constant throughout all periods of Soviet history. But at the same time, Soviet political practice, both domestic and foreign, with relation to Zionism has varied greatly, and it has subordinated to broader policy considerations. But in addition, the salience of each particular type of objection to Zionism varied over the years, but always played a punch. What remained constant is the important and substantial role that propaganda has played over the years. Propaganda, for the purposes of my discussion today, is defined as one of the tactical tools of ideological warfare. It involves the attempt to influence the attitudes of a specific audience through the use of facts, fiction, argument, or suggestion, often supported by the suppression of inconsistent material calculated with the purpose of instilling in the recipient a certain belief, a set of values or convictions which will serve interests of the participant that is performing the propaganda. Essential to the content of propaganda is the sheer repetition, constant repetition in private and public discourse, which readily is experienced as proof of the content of the propaganda itself. And along with propaganda, there are two additional essential tools of ideological warfare. They are first, the creation of a paranoid myth, and secondly, the creation of a big lie. A paranoid myth becomes useful in propaganda when it is placed upon world events, once the myth becomes a self-confirming reality. An example of the paranoid myth is, of course, the blood libel, the accusation that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood in the making of Passover matzah. This myth experienced multiple iterations over time. Paranoid myths are a powerful propaganda tool once they are believed by the masses to be true. And this is certainly the case with the mythical accusation of anti-Zionism that the IDF also lusts to murder Palestinian children in order to sell their organs for profit on the medical black market. An example of the blood libel myth during the Stalinist era is when there was a correspondence that was intercepted in February 1953 by the Control Committee of the Ministry of the State Security of Lithuania, which illustrated the widespread conviction that Jewish medical professions were poisoning children. A Vilnius resident condemned a Jewish doctor who had recently been arrested in Moscow in conjunction with the doctor's plot and who had previously directed a local children's clinic in Vilnius. This is what she told the Russian authorities. Instead of giving our children a vaccine against TB, the Jewish doctor poisoned them with TB. Stalin will employ this kind of blood libel in the infamous doctor's plot of the 1950s, which we will take a look at, of its enormous importance in creating the contemporary anti-Zionism. The second tool, the big lie, represents an extreme distortion of the truth used for the purpose of spreading propaganda. The term was coined by Hitler in Mein Kampf, and according to Hitler, the great masses of the people will more easily fall victim to a big lie than to a small lie. He claimed that if propagandists repeated a big lie often enough, people would be happy to accept it. And eventually, the big lie would inform people's thinking on many other related issues. To be effective, wrote Hitler, the big lie must be so colossal that no one would believe that someone could have the impudence to distort truth so enormously. And the big lie must always contain a certain force of credibility, because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotions than consciously or voluntarily. Both of these tools, when used as propaganda props, promote the inversion of truth, which leads to the inversion of reality, also referred to as an illusionary universe, and the inversion of moral responsibility. So let us turn to the forming of anti-Zionism with Lenin, and especially with Stalin, with regard to propaganda and its tools. Lenin, in contrast to Stalin, was a genuine internationalist and strongly opposed anti-Semitism and remained cool to anti-Zionism. During the period, however, of Lenin's building of a solid class-oriented proletariat, there emerged a thriving socialist-oriented Jewish culture using the Yiddish language, and this resulted in a vast network of socialist Jewish schools, newspapers, journals, theaters, orchestras, cultural centers. This was a brief moment in what would quickly turn to Stalin's ruthless drive for industrialization and the development of a totalitarian state. And Stalin's autocratic reign is absolutely buoyed up by the very apparatus of the communist state. The stage under Stalin is going to be set for the growth of anti-Zionism, the collective, new, and dangerous form of anti-Semitism that aims at delegitimizing, dehumanizing, and all of the other efforts to undo not only Zionism, Israel, but the world Jewish community. Robert Tucker examines in a fantastic, easily approachable form the psychological nature of Stalin and his impact on policy. He describes Stalin as a dictator who is driven by a pathological fear of what he perceives as an insidious conspiratorial force operating at home and abroad to undermine the Soviet system. The ideological rationale for his paranoid outlook was that the Soviet Union, he argued, lives under conditions permanently hostile to capitalist encirclement. And the very word capitalist encirclement for Stalin refers to the empirical, breathing, living Jewish community who he sees as directly attached to bourgeois capitalism as well as imperialism. Stalin's obsessive fears and suspicions go beyond his views of Jews as individuals or as a group. By the 1940s, his anti-Semitic fear is transferred to an abstract political construct. Zionism, defined as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And more than removing or killing individual Jews over this, the target becomes that Zionism itself is perceived as a cancer that must be removed. And to this end, Stalin employs every manipulative tool of the state apparatus until his death in 1953. Stalin namely calls Zionism as a contamination, a disease that could spread to the younger generation. And he saw Zionism as an alternative to Russian nationalism that must be obliterated. Only Russian nationalism, as defined by Stalin, is permitted to exist. The apparatus of the communist state facilitates the removal of Zionism as he hoped it would. A one-party dictatorship, centralized control of all forms of media and propaganda, the capacity to monitor all elements of one's private and public life, and most of all, using fear and terror to realize these objectives through propaganda. And thus, he frames a campaign to remove Zionism as well as an effort to increase the devotion to Russian patriotism, what he calls the authentic Russian communist value system. The campaign to remove Zionism is labeled the Anti-cosmopolitan campaign. The term cosmopolitan is a pejorative term reserved for the Jews, adopting a slew of stereotypes found originally expressed in the protocols of the elders of Zion. The pejorative term cosmopolitanism refers to Jews as belonging nowhere, living everywhere, and thus Jews as ruthless. In contemporary times, we hear the same thing. The cosmopolitans, according to Stalin, are described, especially in propaganda, as persons also without a backbone, persons without any real identity, knowing and worshiping everything foreign and nothing Russian, and were assailed for behaving like passportless wanderers. They are accused of defaming the Russian nation and the notion of the great Russian man. They are accused of lacking loyalty to their socialist fatherland and to the boundless servility towards Western imperialists. The Jewish names of the offenders are always printed in the newspaper with the accusation following their Russian name. By early January 1949, Russian Jews are removed from top positions as part of this campaign, from the Soviet bureaucracy, from the army, and from the professions. And by February, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign spreads to Leningrad. It is there called the Leningrad Affair. Here, Jewish members at the highest level of the Leningrad Party organization are accused of conspiring against the Communist Party, as well as accused of wanting to form a separate Communist Party. And his relation to higher education is direct. In Leningrad, the anti-cosmopolitan spread drives literary scholars and universities to fire Jews. What resulted is informing on one's colleagues became pervasive. Student groups reporting on faculty and other students for insufficient patriotism. Russian humanities and literature departments are primary targets. Professors are attacked for kowtowing to the West, waging an unpatriotic campaign to destroy national distinctiveness of great Russian writers and of using comparative methodology. The professors went on trial and are further accused of disarming the Soviet people ideologically and of the evisceration of the communist educated young people. 4 major department heads are targeted, including chairs of folklore, 2 chairs of Russian literature, and heads of the history department. The work of eminent professors, their written texts, their lectures, are expunged from all journals, all anthologies. Their names are deleted from indexes in all academic libraries. They are removed from all citations in every footnote that they were ever cited. Now, we are going to witness today, when we look at higher education, the erasure of the Jew. And this is the erasure of the Soviet Jew. The results of the anti-cosmopolitan attacks results in thousands of Jews being murdered, the closure of vast Jewish cultural, political, educational, and artistic institutions, and most of all, the notion of the Jew is now defined as a deviant, a person who twists the very notion of the fatherland. There was one additional purge that is so important to understanding contemporary Zionism, anti-Zionism, and that is the purge that is known as the Doctor's Plot, also as the Slansky trial. It is considered the most dramatic anti-Jewish episode in the Soviet Union during Stalin's regime, which involves the unmasking, quote unquote, of a group of prominent Moscow doctors, mostly Jews, as part of a conspiracy. And the conspiracy is another major element of propaganda. The conspiracy is that the Jewish doctors were part of an assassination plot to poison and kill top secret Soviet leadership. It was a continuation of the cosmopolitan accusation against Jewish scientists, but as we're going to see, it went much further. On June 13th, 1953, Pravda and Radio Moscow announced that 9 eminent doctors are under arrest and had confessed to the murdering of 2 leaders who had died in 1945 and 48, respectively. And they were reported to have admitted to conspiring to murdering a number of other prominent figures in the Soviet armed forces, as well as conspiring to murder other Soviet leadership from the Soviet bloc. The number arrested ended up being 37 people. Their confessions were read at the trial, and they would later be known to have resulted, those confessions, after extreme physical torture. The doctors were referred to by the state as terrorist groups who were connected with the intimate Jewish bourgeois nationalist organization, this is hard for me to even say, the Joint Distribution Committee, which the Soviets claimed was established by the American intelligence agency in order to conduct extensive terror and other subversive work in several countries, including the Soviet Union. Those found guilty were also accused of being traitors in support of American imperialism and of course, Zionism, and they were found guilty. The trial is a turning point, an amazing turning point. First, the trial plays out exactly as Stalin had hoped. He was well aware that the trial had nothing to do with Israel, with Zionism, or American imperialism. But given the domestic and foreign policy concerns at the time, he uses it in a way that will resonate with the masses and will repeat it, and absorption and normalization begin to be further developed. Jewish doctors were now said to be murderers, emancipated from the medieval religious fanaticism of the traditional ritual murder accusation. What we have now is a new blood libel model framework for understanding the Jews in a way that hits home to us today. In this secularized permutation, Jews are still killing children, or at least said to be harming them, but now not for ritual purposes. The Doctor's Plot constitutes a modernized revival of the demonic image of the Jew embodied in the blood libel and in charges that Jews poisoned wells and spread bubonic plague. But now, the age-old image of the murderer Jews is fused with Soviet image of the political traitor and political loyalties. And in the widespread outburst of virulent anti-Semitism in Soviet society between January and April 53, it indicates that Stalin tapped into a potent and vibrant pre-existing tendency to absolutely believe this propaganda. The second reason that we look at the doctor's plot is that Zionism is used for the first time as a term of abuse in a trial, as the Soviets terminate their brief support for Israel in their 1947 vote at the United Nations in support of Israel's becoming a legal, nationally recognized country, and had now found an alliance with the Arab states and the Warsaw Pact nations, and now, at this time, in deep opposition to Israel. Stalin's short-lived support for Israel is originally based on the hope that early Zionist socialism would inspire Israel to join the Soviet bloc. And this, of course, did not occur. Instead, Israel joins the Western alliances. This decision triggers Stalin's revenge of the transference of intense hatred and demonic assessment of Jews onto Zionism, onto Israel, and onto world Jewry. The anti-Zionist campaign that would spread globally in the 20th and 21st century begins. By 1948, every day Pravda is reporting that today Israel, they say in 48, is an outpost of American imperialism. And third, and this is the most powerful of the Zionism effort, is the linkage of the term Zionism to Nazism. The Soviets fabricate a link between Zionism and Nazism. According to the in-depth work of Robert Wisrich, Jeffrey Herf, and other very important Soviet scholars, for the Stalinists, Zionist Nazism is the agent of a world Zionist cabal of international financiers seeking to subvert the Soviet Union and the entire socialist camp. Nowhere in the West, however, has the twinning of the Nazi swastika and the Star of David as symbols of genocide, as the symbols of genocide fascism, been so insistently promoted as in the Soviet Union. And in no other state has the campaign been so carefully orchestrated from above, so remorseless and intense. It appeared for the first time during the Slansky trial, which depicted the Czech communists of the Jewish origin not only as crypto-Zionist traitors, but as fascist shock troops for the subversion of the popular democracy known as the USSR. Joseph Stalin, the inventor of this post-Holocaust anti-Zionist phantasma, learned from Hitler the importance of using euphemism at indispensable moments. And what is created by this fabricated linkage of Zionism and Nazism is the corporate Jew as an invisible, omnipotent enemy and in justification of vigilance, of internal repression, and of death. What better method of disguising the source of inspiration and providing an acceptable mask for Stalin's own Judophobia than the equation of Zionism with Nazism? All of us have marched, all of us have joined, all of us are from the expression of Am Yisrael Chai. And at those marches, the signs of swastikas originate here, saying to us as individuals that Jews are Nazis, that Zionism equals Nazism, begins here. Upon Stalin's death, future communist leaders at first used this claim regarding Zionism very carefully. As Israel's relations, however, steadily developed with West Germany and the West, it is escalated and eventually inducted into the slogan Hall of Fame of the Soviet propagandists. It starts with the accusation charging Zionist leaders having contacts with Nazi officials in German-occupied Europe. It escalated to attacks on Ben-Gurion as a tool of the Bonn revanchists. The accusations intensify, and eventually, as we now know, the charge has been adopted by anti-Zionists globally. We hear it from the BDS, we hear it from the SJP, we hear it in our everyday life, and it is unquestioned. The timing of this accusation could not have been more perfect. For throughout the West, anti-Vietnam movements rapidly adopted an anti-imperialism and an anti-American invective. Student groups protesting racism, inequality, and strong anti-American policies eventually integrate this charge into their top 10 repertoire of chants. Third world movements are developing rapidly at this time and globally supporting Vietnam liberation, Palestinian nationalism liberation, and eventually absorbing the anti-Zionism charge along with the hope of joining the struggle against imperialism and colonialism. And the motto is rise up against American imperialism and rise up against Zionism, the perpetrators of inequality. Thus, the Stalinist campaign is an enormously effective vehicle in creating and sustaining a big lie as well as an unbelievable paranoid myth. Its relation to Nazism is the stamp of today, and it leads to the normalization. The Six-Day War transforms geopolitics, but it also transforms the breadth and the success of the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign. For world Jewry, the victory of the small nation of Israel over the Arab nations and their proxy, the Soviet Union, reignites an intense pride, identification, and an attachment to Zionism and to the Jewish homeland. And at the same time, it greatly bruised the perception of the Soviet Union and its Arab partners as an unbeatable threat and an ideological counterweight to American imperialism. As a result, the Soviets embark on the longest and most expansive anti-Semitic campaign in the history of the Soviet Union. The anti-Zionist propaganda effort would not merely be stepped up, but it's going to flood the globe and the international stage. The outcome of the Six-Day War impacts the international left's views towards Israel. The international left in 1967, according to Professor Herf, referred to four distinct currents: the Soviet Union, its Warsaw Pact allies, and the communist parties around the world. Secondly, it refers to the Maoist China and the Maoist groups it inspired, leftist governments in what was then the Third World, and the global new left, especially the Western Europeans, Japan, and the United States. And by the mid-1950s, the first three of the left groups mentioned above express hostile sentiments and actions toward Israel and support for the Palestinians. The Soviet Union begins to arm the Arab states in the 1950s. Communist China opens an office for the PLO in Beijing in 65. The non-aligned nations at the UN viewed Israel as on the wrong side of the global divide between imperialism and anti-imperialism prior to the Six-Day War, and this intensifies. And for these three currents of the left, the war served as an intensification vehicle to voice their politics for the Palestinian movement, for Arabism and its form of nationalism, and against Israel. The larger change occurs of the new left in Europe and the US, which moves from empathy and support after the Shoah towards Jews and towards Israel to a clear antagonism from which they have not deviated. Starting in 1967, the utilization of what Leslie Clapp coins Holocaust inversion intensifies. Accusations of Israel behaving like the Nazis are stated by the Soviet ambassador to the UN. Yaakov Malik states the following: Israel's surprise attack that starts in 1967 war can only be compared to the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. In September 1971, Malik hits his home run punch against Jews, Israel, and Zionism. He delivers a major address in which the evil incarnate, Zionism equals racism, becomes legitimized on the international stage. And these are his words to the Security Council. The Israeli ambassador to the UN is indignant at our parallel between Zionism and fascism, and Zionism as racist. But why? It's so simple. Why is he questioning this? Both are racist ideologies. The fascists advocated the superiority of the Aryan race as the highest among all races and all peoples of the world. The fascists considered that the ideal was the Aryan and blue eyes and blonde hair. I do not know what are the external sides that we could see a Zionist, but their racist theory is just the same. The fascists advocated hatred toward all people, and the Zionist does the exact same. For with their role of the chosen people, isn't that the chosen people? Isn't that just raw racism? What is the difference between Zionism and fascism, says Malik, if the essence of the ideology is racism's hatred of all other people? Let's take a look, he says, at the chosen people. The people selected by God. Where in the second half of the 20th century does one hear anyone advocating this criminal, absurd superiority of one race over another? Try to justify this from the rostrum, Israel. Try to go up to the rostrum of the United Nations and say it, and watch what happens. Try to prove that you are the chosen people above all the other bodies in the world. Malik effectively lays the ideological groundwork for transforming Zionism into the worst enemy nation of the international community. And together with the 1975 UN resolution 3329, establishing Zionism as racism, Malik adds the moral sanctification that would provide an ideological legitimacy and the legitimacy of international law on defining Zionism as a cancer, as Zionism being the opposite of social justice and human rights theory. It takes but a few years for the horrific stigma to take hold globally. I just need some direction here. to check on time and see. Okay, you will let me know, David.
You can take a couple more minutes, okay?
Okay, so what I am going to do, and this is, again, a very deeply piece of work, and I'm going to, at this point, move towards the implications of this in higher education. But to please know that I want our listeners to keep following ISGAP and the research efforts of our wonderful fellows to really get the in-depth understanding of contemporary Zionism that the community so deserves. And now I will turn to the implications, and thank you for being patient. One of the first implications that we find is the invisibility of all things Jewish in higher education. I'd like to start by something I was personally involved in, and that is a debate at the National Women's Studies Association. Women's studies is critically important at our universities, gender studies, LGBTQ studies. It is extremely, extremely important. And at this 1983, 40 years ago, one of the most eminent scholars takes to the floor. Her name, many of you will know her, is Professor Evelyn Beck, Emeritus of the University of Maryland in Women's Studies, Comparative Literature, and these are her words. Excuse me. I come here today to speak about Jewish invisibility, a problem throughout higher education. I was an active member, she says, for so many years, and what I have seen is something profound. I voice my objection today to a change in the constitution of this organization as being against anti-Semitism. You defined it as prejudice directed at both Arabs and Jews in your new constitution. Now, I certainly will not deny that there is anti-Arabism and Islamophobia, and that it may be necessary for NWSA to list this in their additional forms of racism. However, anti-Semitism is unique to the Jews. It means a prejudice and hatred and potential genocide to just Jews. So I must ask, what does it mean when an organization refuses to go on record as being unequivocally against Jew hatred? If it takes the term Jew hatred to make NWSA take a clear position, so be it. But as a Jew, I am telling you now, I do not feel safe here in this room, and I will not believe in NWSA's commitment to stop Jew hating if it does not address this issue. I will not settle for less. This is the organization's reply. Exact words. It is not necessary to name anti-Semitism by itself, for it is assumed under racism. Evelyn's reply. Look, the Women of Color Caucus of NWSA explicitly will not allow Jews to join because they define Jews as white. I'm here to say 67% of Israelis are Jews of color. It is hard for me to believe that this was said nearly 40 years ago. The organization is not wise for NWSA to include it to appear that we are supporting Israel in any way or form. To do what you ask would have repercussions suggesting that we support Israel. Now, again, I have her whole statement, but that just gives you that this is not what we are facing today in higher education, something new. It is established, and the movement on it is not moving in a good direction. We are not merely a group that will be lumped into the word racism. Our particularity is essential to our soul, to our being, and to the education of the academy. So now I will turn to a second model besides invisibility. Excuse me.
Yes, it's
I'm so sorry. Do I have any extra time?
well. If you just make it brief, I want
to questions.
to allow time for questions.
Okay, so I will turn to one more.
Okay.
A critical important model, and it is explicated in terms of explaining it to what we are faced with by Professor James Wald, and he calls it the new replacement theory, and Edith Whipp calls it Zionism inversion. For Wald, the adoption of the new replacement theory refers to the contemporary form of supersessionism, replacing Zionist claims to the legitimate basis of its existence. And according to its proponents, Palestine is the sole moral and practical heir to the land. First, he says, some facts. The Jews are a people indigenous to the ancient Near East. Zionism, the Jewish national movement, was morally as well as comparatively comparable to any other nationalism. The reestablishment of a Jewish community and the Commonwealth was therefore an act of restoration rather than usurpation. In 1922, the League of Nations unanimously approved that Palestine mandate the preamble, which state, whereas recognition has been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and the grounds to reconstitute their national homeland, we unanimously support. This was once, like the Declaration of Independence, called a self-evident truth prior to delegitimization. He looks at the opposition called replacement theory. One, they conclude Israel's purported right to exist derives only from the Holocaust. Europe created Israel based on emotions of guilt rather than reason and fairness. Palestinians paid the price for the crimes of Europeans. Israeli actions are so deplorable. They, of course, include genocide, murder, ethnic cleansing, racism, apartheid, that Israel has turned into the Nazis. And what is the significance of this now? How do you think you would react learning this? What might be the reaction on students who are absorbing this? What is really going on here, says Wald, is not only false, but the effort to erase the entire history of political and religious Zionism, the centrality of the land in the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish literature, Talmud, Jewish language, the tradition are being erased. All of this is the continuous evolution of the history of extermination of East European Jewry, but this time it is in the erasure of the academic community. And why is this significant? Because all of us today understand the linkage of where this begins and the role of the Soviets. And it is now absorbed and normalized in mainstream. And it gets further absorbed after the Lebanese War, the Second Intifada, and etc. Again, I've run out of time, but I will tell you that I was looking at 5 distinct models in the absorption of this, and I very, very much look forward to your questions and comments, and thank you for the opportunity to present something that is so very, very important to us all. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Professor Cannon. I put a note in the chat to everyone saying if you have a question, you can enter it in the chat. There's also a Q&A function that you can use. And I don't see any at the moment, but actually I have some questions of my own.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, oh, and thank you. Dr. Cannon, that was amazing as always. And I think that one of the most pressing and disturbing points you make is not just, it concerns not just the acceptability of anti-Semitism or the erasure of the Jews, which is, you know, related in academia, but it's not just acceptable, but it's required. It's morally required. If Zionism is racism, you have to be opposed to racism to be a moral person. And if the Zionist state is racist, what is morally required to do with the Zionist state? Has to be dismantled, doesn't it?
The logical conclusion of what you're stating is exactly what is out there, that it must be an imperative, but now they're calling it a moral imperative, that Israel is such the embodiment, it is argued by the anti-Semitic anti-Zionists, that the dissemblance of the state is now essential. And they have all the time in the world to argue this, because they're arguing it in very small, successful pieces that is gathering a storm.
So do you find that opposing voices like your own, like those of some of us in ISGAP, those voices tend to get stifled in my experience very often?
Well, first of all, many of the scholars writing on this, and it is a very growing concern, call this the litmus test for acceptability. Either you're going to be silent and hold your thoughts to yourself, or you are going to become part of the community that feels this. But now, with the growth of the fantastic work of ISGAP, what it felt like reading all of the scholars that are so committed with the effort of Charles and yourself and the entire team of really developing the ability to have new scholars take this information, young scholars, into the university to try to be the voices. That is essential. And what I do find is now and then I find voices, but between ISGAP and the AEN, the Academic Engagement Network, we found a family. People are now much more than colleagues with each other. We are there for each other. And the instances of the BDS, the SJP, the failure of administrations to reply in a forthright manner, they usually reply in something that is politically correct. Anti-Semitism is wrong, and nothing is done about it. So again, we have to keep going. We can't get tired. As my family tells me, you don't even deserve yet an ottoman to put your feet up. So we are on this and working terribly hard to try to reach a greater public. But is there a feeling of uneasiness for us and loneliness? Yes.
Yes, we have a question from Diane Kreef, who's asking, how do we go about changing the propaganda? I mean, how do we alter the discourse here? Which propaganda, as you say, it's calculated not to inform, but to incite, I think.
And it's also well, absolutely to incite. There's no doubt about it. It is a calculation. And I think when it started, that we were slow on the uptake to realize the depths of what has occurred. And consequently, we always appear to be putting out a fire rather than being proactive. So what we need is for students, donors to universities, alumni, academics to come forth and create new courses and create open debates where possible, where rules are established that the humiliation of a Zionist professor is not going to occur, which is a hard thing to be sure of today, but we have the ability to take step by step and be the voice of, not of the opposition, but of our truth, of really understanding what it means to be a Jew and what it means to support the homeland.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. Not of the opposition, because we don't want to buy into the premise.
Exactly.
So we have Miriam Ellman of the Academic Engagement Network has something in the chat here. She says, outstanding presentation. Today's anti-Israel movement seeks to distinguish the good Jew from the bad Jew. She's right about that. The good Jews are those who disavow their particularism, their Zionist identity, and denounce Israel. The bad Jews are the Zionists, defined as racist and aligned with white supremacists. Students and faculty are smeared with this, as she correctly notes. And she asks, did the Soviets do the same and to the same degree? Today, she asks, Judaism as Jewish practice is celebrated on campus. Was this the same in academia in the Soviet Union?
Well, that first of all, Miriam, I can't thank you enough for everything that you are doing in this area, in leadership, vision, and again, we are convinced that you have never gone to sleep, and you have about 20 arms just working every issue, and we thank you, and we love you. The issue of the question is great. Whether we're looking at Nazism and whether we're looking at the Soviet expertise, you really find the killing of the voice of the Jew, the murdering of the voice of the Jew, the putting in the gulag the voice of the Jew. And again, the Leningrad affair, where they're totally erased. I mean, from every aspect that they ever lived about the voice of the Jew. But at a time when there were periods within Russia, which we're also acquainted with due to so many of studying all the way from the Pale of Settlement on, is that the institutionalization of Jewish life and Jewish learning, however covert it had to be, was always present. And again, what we find is under authoritarian regimes, it is to be obliterated. It is those schools that teach this are to be closed. The people who propagate it are to be removed. And consequently, it is an erasure of ideas. It is an erasure of people's lives. And it's an erasure of, did we ever live? And what was so interesting when Soviet Jewry began the movement, and then of them coming to Chicago as one of the cities that they did come to, is again, the limited identification that they had with the community. Let me just share a wonderful addition. I have taught so many of their children at the university level, and their interest in Judaism is beyond heartwarming. And that's where we find the strength. That's where we know that this can be a step. We need a vaccine and a booster. We need to make sure that we are the vaccine and boosters of young people and scholars and emerging scholars to consider studying this in great depth and never to be erased again.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful point. I think engaging Judaism, understanding Judaism is a key to this, even or especially in a time where in many quarters of academia, there's a certain hostility toward religion, or at least some religions like Judaism. But if we have time, just a couple minutes or so, Diane came back with another good question. I mean, we're putting out fires, and she comments, that for the moment there are many small groups doing something. Academic Engagement Network, the Amcha Initiative, ISGAP, Brandeis Center, others. She says, don't you think we need a whole network so that can come together and follow the same beat as our enemies do? Our enemies are very well organized.
Oh my God, yeah. And not only that, our enemies don't take questions, right? And
Right.
that's the most interesting thing. You're not allowed to even approach BDS with an alternative. I think, first of all, there has been a lot of excellent research on this situation being played out differently in different regions of the country. In some regions, it hasn't emerged as a massive problem as it has in other regions. Consequently, the retention of the decentralized official organizations must be kept. And do I think that a united front in this area, it has to have a front that understands that there is a two-track system in academia. One is what's happening to students' lives, and the other is the faculty's concerns are not identical whatsoever to those of the students. So how do we develop these two separate tracks in a way that is pragmatic and applicable, and at the same time using academics as they should be, factual, empirical, objective research to back up every single point that we would make. And if we had such an organization, I think it would be very well welcomed. And thank you for the great question.
Yeah, thank you. Daphne, are we about out of time? I think we might be.
Hello, my mic was not working. We are pretty much out of time, but we have a couple minutes for final remarks.
A couple of minutes. Any last comments or questions? Let me just underscore an essential point that Professor Cannon has made here today. And since many of us here are professors, this anti-Semitism historically, as Ruth Weiss has pointed out, Deborah Lipstadt has reiterated, comes from the intelligentsia. That doesn't come up from below, it's from above, intellectually, ideologically, theologically. So those of us in the academy have a particular responsibility here. I mean, Nazi Germany is just one of many historical examples that go back over centuries. I can recommend Max Weinreich's book, Hitler's Professors.
Right. It's wonderful.
So we professors, we who aspire to be scholars, I think have one responsibility more. We have an even greater responsibility to address the problem, especially those of us who are senior, who don't run the risks of junior faculty whose careers in many cases can be jeopardized by angering certain people, right? So I know Ellen, I mean, you obviously don't care whom you anger.
I know.
And I don't either. So Ellen, I want to give you a special thanks for your courage and your eloquence and your insight and for being with us today. And, you know, putting to us the question, put to the first human, where are you?
Right.
How shall we answer? Yeah.
Well, I want to, in closing, really point out how important your concluding remark is about the role of Jewish intellectuals and to speak up and out. When Senator from Massachusetts was running for president, Harry, David Makowski was his Middle East advisor. And at one of the major universities, I mean, he is a very, very important person in understanding geopolitics with great astuteness and objectivity. And they had a major event, and there was not one professor that attended from the social sciences and the humanities. The record records that instead there were retired professors, professors from engineering, professors from math, and so forth. And that is another one of our problems. One is that we need all professors of conscience and intellect to, whether you are in the field of studying, stand up with us, stand strong, stand clear. We are polite and powerful, and help in this very important, this is not an inflection point. This is going to be a journey, and we need everyone on board. Again, I want to thank ISGAP for all that they are doing, to thank you, David, not only for being just so brilliant a scholar, but so wise, and thank you for your friendship. And again, special thanks to Miriam Ellman, who is a fearless leader. It's been a pleasure to be with you this morning. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you all. Be safe, be blessed, be well. Thank you. And look for other ISGAP seminars.
Stay, absolutely.
Bye-bye.